Hello, everyone. Welcome to The Person You Want to Be. I am your host, Eric Teplitz. I am delighted to be joined today by Jennah-Louise Salkeld. Jennah-Louise is a mindset coach, human connection specialist, and host of the To Be Human podcast. On her show, she shares conversations with high achievers that get to the heart of who they are behind their personas and accomplishments, humanizing them in such a way as to challenge and inspire her listeners to get curious about and explore more of their own potential. Needless to say, her podcast is very much up my alley. Jennah-Louise is also something of a high achiever herself. An avid reader, writer, and self-explorer, she holds a double degree in law and international relations and politics, has solo backpacked in nearly 50 countries, has volunteered in Kenya, India, and the Northern Territory of Australia, focusing on women's empowerment groups and youth education. And she is an outdoor enthusiast and accomplished endurance athlete, who, among other things, is the only female finisher of a 24-hour military-inspired event, and was a participant once upon a time on the television series Australian Survivor. Currently, she works as a mindset coach to high net worth leaders, executives, and entrepreneurs, helping them discover deeper connection, meaning, and fulfillment. Jennah-Louise Salkeld, welcome to The Person You Want to Be.
Beautiful. Thank you for having me, Eric.
I am so grateful that you made the time to do this, and I'm delighted to have you here. And I'd like to start, as I often do with these interviews, with asking you about your childhood, and specifically, if you could paint a picture of your environment in which you grew up, where that was, what it was like. And what I'm really interested to know is your earliest sense or your earliest memories of who you wanted to be in the world, your earliest impressions of what it is you wanted to do or who you wanted to be. And they can be as fanciful as, as children often are about what they want to do or be. But sometimes these things are kind of interesting to hear. So let's start there.
Beautiful question. Thank you. So I grew up on the east coast of Australia in a little town called Byron Bay. It's actually the most easterly part of Australia. And I did a sport called surf life saving over here. So I was very sort of beach orientated. I was very active, very sporty. I was an only child, single mother. So I spent sort of a lot of time sort of outdoors or with friends. And I think, what I really love about your question is kind of reflecting on what I thought I was going to, who I thought I was going to be when I grew up. And it kind of reminded me that because I was an only child, I read a lot. That was sort of my activity to sort of keep myself entertained. And the books that I was really pulled to was always sort of autobiographies and biographies of people and memoirs. It was always learning about people and their story and their life journey. And particularly sort of at that point in time, I was really, really pulled to humanitarian work, people sort of going to Africa or like parts of Asia and sort of what they were doing over there, sort of reading about doctors and teachers and nurses and all these amazing people. And so at that point in my life, sort of in correlation with I used to write a lot also, I used to sort of do these things because being an only child, you have to self-entertain, was sort of reading and writing came very naturally. And so I remember sort of as I was sort of around probably 8 to 10 years old, I sort of had this clarity that I really wanted to be an investigative journalist. That was kind of like my thing. I really wanted to learn about people and tell their stories. And I think sort of what has obviously come out of that was I didn't become a journalist, but I certainly have become someone that is living and breathing this idea of exploration of people and learning about them and humanizing them and understanding them in a way of, of also coming from the angle of service and contribution, which kind of relates back to that humanitarian side as well.
Fascinating. Were there any
Yeah.
people in particular whose biographies or autobiographies you read that stand out to you, or people that were sort of singular inspirations to you? I'm guessing you read, child-friendly versions of these, depending on your age, or were you precocious in reading, kind of upper level things from
Yeah,
a young age?
pretty
Okay.
precocious.
Not surprising.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know specific people because, this goes back a while, because I guess like that kind of highlights, because I'm kind of like trying to make sense of this, because obviously this is like a new reflection. So I appreciate this, but there's covers that come to my mind as you ask that question. I don't remember their names, but I think that kind of highlights the point in itself, is it didn't have to be these, well-known people. It was just, somebody that thought it was a good idea to write a book about their life and their experiences of it, and just learning about that, whether it was sort of, this element of high achiever and someone that's well respected and has status, or whether it was, when we sort of talk about humanitarian work, whether it was the doctor or nurse or teacher, or whether it was the patient or the student writing the book. It was sort of this mix of just whoever wanted to sort of share their story was certainly something that pulled me in.
Very interesting. Were you ever inspired by Jane Goodall in particular by any chance? Because that's the first thing I thought of, her story as a very small girl. She had these dreams of going to Africa.
Yeah. It's interesting that you mentioned that, because next to investigative journalists, I wanted to work with gorillas when I was younger. So that's a very intuitive thing that you just said and reminded me of.
Diane
I
Fossey.
wasn't, yeah, well, that's sort of exactly. I mean, I think, I guess like, I don't know. No, not her specifically, but I think when you sort of talk about her story in relation to like dreaming of going to Africa, that was really true to me when I was younger. Like I remember having sleepless nights at a very young age because I wanted to go to Africa. I wanted to go there so badly. And it was such a innate feeling. It felt like it wasn't taught. It was just this like inner knowing that like I will go there. And so at the age of 18, my first trip, I'd been to Vanuatu when I was at 4 years old, but my first trip after that at 18 was a solo trip to Kenya. And so I literally like came out of school, and it was the first trip that I went to by myself, spent my money. And it was just, I remember sort of like setting foot in Kenya and just feeling like I was home. It was just the most beautiful feeling, the most fulfilling feeling. And, it was interesting because at that time I'd had so much sort of resistance to that. You're 18 years old, you're a blonde little girl from Australia. What would it's not safe to go over to Kenya in Africa on your own. But
How
I
did
did
it go
anyway.
over? How did it go over with your mom and peers for that matter?
My mom's pretty amazing. I think, she learned that at a very young age, I kind of did what I wanted. So she's very supportive in that. She's always been very supportive in me just being who I am. So she was a lot more open to it. My dad kind of made this passing comment that like, as long as he doesn't have to pay a ransom. So he was kind of a little bit more protective in thinking that, it's dangerous over there and things could happen. But I think, relating back to this idea of when I was young, it was that innate inner knowing that I intuitively knew, things would be okay. Like all would be well. Anything that would happen over there was, meant to be, so to speak. And that the most important thing was listening to that inner knowing, taking action of it, despite resistance from other people.
Hmm. You mentioned your dad. So you said that you were raised by a single mom, but your dad obviously
Yes.
was still in the picture. So you had a relationship with him growing up.
Yeah, so we sort of lived in separately, sort of like 10 hours away a lot of the time. So I would see him, but I wouldn't see him often. And then when I sort of moved a little bit closer to him with my mum, I would see him every second weekend.
Hmm.
But something that's like really beautiful, like, as we're aware, like I've been doing a lot of self-development work. And what's really beautiful is that I think when I think about my childhood, I don't have imagery of my dad that often, but in the last few years, I've really made an effort of connecting deeply with him, um, and mending that relationship, or
Hmm.
at least improving that relationship, deepening that relationship. And I can certainly say now we are the closest we've ever been, and
Hmm.
it's really beautiful. So I think, on that sort of side note, I don't think it's ever too late to deepen your connection with family or friends, or no matter what's happened when you've been younger. I think sometimes we can have a habit of taking these patterns of relationship till to our deathbed, and I just don't think it's necessary. I think we have the opportunity to be courageous
Hmm.
in sort of, as I said, mending or deepening those connections that may not have always been there.
Yeah, courage is the word that came to my mind. But
Mm.
obviously, when you're talking about any human relationship, no one person can sustain it, and no one person. So he obviously met you halfway, and he obviously was open to it and to, deepening the connection. You, it sounds like,
Mm.
had the courage to initiate and the effort, but it was received. And that
Mm.
that part we can't control, whether or the
Right.
other the other person, but the
Yeah.
only way to find out is to take that courageous step. So good for
Yeah.
you for doing that.
Yeah, it was really beautiful because, my dad is a man of few words, and I'm 33, and I had this, the first conversation of this intentional sort of deepening of connection a few years ago. And I said to him, I said, Dad, and this is when I sort of got back from living overseas. Um, you haven't said I love you in 15 years. And
Wow.
because of that, I haven't said that.
Hmm.
And I said, I've sort of made the decision that I'm going to start saying that to you, and you don't have to say
Hmm.
it back. I would like you to, but you don't have to. And this is, my moment to have courage and start saying it to you, because I do love you, and I want to be able to, show you that love. And it was quite beautiful because obviously he has his own trauma around that. There's a big reason why for him saying I love you is a big deal. So at the start it was a bit clunky. He sort of said it and then he didn't. And now like every single phone conversation,
Wow.
he will say like, I love you. And that is massive. I've always known that he has loved me. So it's not about that, but it's about seeing that now he too is able to be courageous
Hmm.
and say something that for 15 years he felt too afraid to say.
Wow.
Yeah,
Feel
it
like
was such a good
I should
lesson.
pause there for a moment and take that in, because the first thing that was so striking about your talking about that was you did not waste any time. You did not beat around the bush. You went like right there. I mean, you
Yeah,
like that's a big, Dad, you haven't told me you love me in 15 years. I mean,
yeah.
talk about icebreakers. Like that's not usually the one you see in the
Right.
in the guide to small talk. Or
Well, I think
breaking the
when
ice with
those
people.
moments like call on
Hmm.
that element of courage, sometimes it's almost easier to just go straight to the core of it
Hmm.
instead of sort of like batting around the bush, trying to sort of feel out what it's going to be like. I knew, and like I said, when I said to him, I think what helped with it was that I had no expectation on him.
Hmm.
This was me and what I wanted to do. And I was asserting my own self empowerment. And he could have turned around and ignored me or not have said it. like everything was going to be okay with me because it felt true to me.
Well, that's pretty important,
able
I
to
think,
show up.
I'm glad you shared that.
Incredibly.
Hmm.
Very
Wow.
important, because I've also had a different experience with family members where a conversation similar to that, or something that is getting to the core of a concern, has not been met with openness. And you have to be prepared for that. Just because you've decided to make a change in your life, if that is in relationship to somebody else, you can't expect them to be in the same place as you all the time or be open to that. And you have to be okay with that. You have to know that all you can do is what is in your control, and you can be happy and proud because of that. But it doesn't
You can do right by yourself.
You can do right by yourself, but another person's reaction or response is not a reflection of you.
Yeah. And it's not in your control. And when you make a statement like, you don't have to say I love you back.
Yeah.
In your case, it sounded like you meant it. But you don't know how the other person may feel obliged, or they may feel they need to take care of you. But in your situation, in your case, you had made the decision, you had obviously given it thought, and you were prepared for any reaction. And maybe somehow when you communicated to him, you don't have to say it, you can say it if you want, but I'm going to say it. Maybe somehow that was your okayness with whatever he decided to do, perhaps also came through in your communication with him.
Yeah.
Because if it comes from a more sort of needy or desperate place, I think that also gets communicated as well. And then people may just tell us what we want to hear because they feel they have to.
Right. And people don't work well with other people's demands or expectations, or that element of like guilt if you're putting on someone, like, if you don't say this is going to make me feel a way. Like, people respond best when they feel like they have space for them to make their own decision. And I think that's certainly what I did in that conversation.
Yeah, that's impressive, I have to say.
Yeah, thanks. It paid off.
Yeah, and that's very beautiful to hear too. Yeah. It sounds like you've also had the opposite experience where, it did not necessarily get the hoped for result, but you still probably, I'm guessing, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but in that other situation you were referring to, which you can talk about or not if you want, you also had come to that place inside where you were going to be okay with whatever response you got. Is that true?
Yes. I mean, those moments are always harder because you see sort of these two paths that are right before you. And this person, we speak about my dad and how beautiful of experience that is. And this person decides to take the other path, and they don't want to, connect with you, or they don't want to get to the core of what's going on with you. I think it can be disappointing to an extent, but I think what I've learned through experiences like that is to really accept that as individuals, we have our own journey, so to speak. And it is not my responsibility to feel shame or guilt, or even responsibility itself for the other person's journey. And so it's in sort of that acceptance and allowance that, okay, this person has chosen this path, and now bring it back to me and my empowerment. What can I do from here? Because I think it's very easy in a situation like that to, sort of sit and simmer in that disappointment and continue to have these unmet expectations that fuel resentment, for example. And as we're aware, it's like emotions like resentment and anger, like they're just poison to us. The other person is not experiencing that. That's just sort of us sort of hurting us. So it's about being able to process those emotions and be able to sort of come back to that sense of self-empowerment of what can I do from here, rather than feeling like we're helpless and we're powerless because of somebody else's response or behavior.
Yeah. And I think another important piece of this, which is easier said than done, as all of this is really, but is you really need to be honest with yourself, because I
Yeah.
think that you could approach a situation like that and you could tell yourself, I'm going to be okay with whatever they say.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe not. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
you might believe it too. You might think, no, I'm
Yeah.
prepared to, and then you really don't find out until you find out. And then you see
Mm-hmm.
how you're able to handle it. But I like what you said about then with whatever response you get, however disappointing it might be, then taking it upon yourself to decide, okay, what can I do with this now that is empowering for me, with,
Exactly.
because we can never control other people's behavior, choices, decisions, to only our own,
Right.
which is, the huge life lesson that I think a lot of us continually learn over and over again in different contexts. There's so
Yeah.
much I want to get to, and so many threads I want to pull on based on the little that I know about you, and all of these
Mm-hmm.
interesting facets of your story. So let's go back to, you went to Kenya. How long were you there on that initial trip? And
Mm-hmm.
what happened next, so to speak?
So I went there for a month. I went there with a volunteer organization, and I'd kind of like set it up pretty well. Like I had sort of paid extra money for an experience where, you had certain accommodation, you had certain security within like the compound, so to speak. Like everything was kind of like quite cozy and comfy. And I sort of worked in different orphanages, and kind of it was more at 18 years old, having the experience, just going there, kind of exploring, why is it that I was pulled towards here? What are the sort of different opportunities over here? What are the people like? What are this culture like, etc. So it was a beautiful firsthand experience. So what happened after that was quite interesting. I left it, a couple of years. I started my law, politics, and international relations degree or degrees. And I ended up sort of looking through like an old box of things, and found a book that I had bought in Kenya. And it was written by a man that had sort of, he was from the UK, and he was had lived there for quite a few decades and working sort of within his own volunteer organization with the Maasai people. And when I read that book, it just kind of enlightened sort of what had been sort of the last couple of years since sort of being there. And so I ended up emailing the author of this book and just being like, I love this book. I love this story. Can I please come out and, in real time, in reality, experience what I've read in this book?
Here's
And
the
he,
investigative reporter coming out.
right? I'm very good at that. I'm very good at reaching out to people. It's one of my, it's paid off, certainly, in my lifetime. I'm a little nosy. I contact a lot of authors. But yeah, he wrote back to me, sure, like, come along. So I ended up organizing a trip back over there.
Where were you
This
in
is,
your degree program at that point?
I think I would have been it would have been first or second year. It was only a couple of years after I'd been there initially. And yeah, I went over there. So this is with a new organization, obviously, and just really felt at home. I felt like I'd found a family very quickly, from another country. And I started sort of working with women's empowerment groups and being a lot more sort of on the ground, hands on, because it was such a small organization. One of the beautiful things is you can really sort of get your hands dirty, so to speak. So I was sort of like immersed in this. I would stay out with the Maasai in their beautiful, manettas that are made out of cow dung, and we would have no electricity. And it
Wow.
was a really authentic experience. We'd have to go and travel for our water every day. And it was just absolutely amazing. Some of my fondest memories are from those nights. And then sort of following on from that, I went back there 2 more times for that organization. So all up, I'd been back to Kenya 4 times. I would say sort of the 3 trips after 18 years old were a lot more sort of meaningful and invested. But I was always so incredibly fulfilled when I went over there, and I went out into sort of the Rift Valley of Kenya, and we're just around these amazing people. Because what was so fascinating is like a lot of this sort of volunteer work, you kind of can make these assumptions that these people are living really like hard and happy lives. And what was so beautiful about those experiences was going out there when everyone had next to nothing, but they were so happy and so grateful and so connected, and there was so much community.
Hmm.
And it kind of like awakened these parts of me that I had realized only then were dampened or disconnected from my life back here in Australia at that time.
Hmm. That's I've heard a variation of that story many times, of
Yeah.
people going to, poverty-stricken places
Mm-hmm.
and sort of having a disconnect, a surprising reaction of, wow, these people are so much happier than I am with
Yeah.
so much less, or maybe
Yes.
maybe not much happier than I am, but like it can be striking, how we think of the Maslow's hierarchy of
Yeah.
needs, right? And people that maybe just have the bare minimum of those, can, not that they don't necessarily want an improvement, but that they already have a certain, they have certain things in some cases over us, like you were talking about, family bonds,
Mm,
a sense of community and
right.
connection.
Yes.
I think that's must have been fascinating to actually experience that firsthand rather than just hear about it or read about it.
Absolutely, because I think it's sort of that element of like in more Western societies, there's this element of like individualism and competition, and it just fuels this element of separation. And so it's like, okay, we have nicer things and a lot more material things, and we have these things that people desire. But when it comes down to it, what we actually learn is that like more things doesn't equal like more happiness or fulfillment or connection. And that because these people are living with the bare minimum, they're having to connect as a community
Hmm.
to genuinely survive. But it kind of like brings you back to that sort of like really like primal state of what really bonds us, and why so many people in our society these days are lonely, because we have all that we need these days, and because of that we're not relying necessarily
Hmm.
on each other as much as we used to. And so there is that element of loneliness and disconnection and isolation that is happening, that I think is sort of leading to these like less meaningful, less fulfilling lives.
Fascinating. So you have these experiences abroad and then you come back home. I'm guessing you were studying in Australia. That's where you're.
Yes.
Okay. What was the school you went to?
So I started at a university called Griffith University on the Gold Coast, and then I moved down to Sydney to a university called Macquarie University. Macquarie was great for sort of international focus.
Hmm.
They had lots of sort of global leadership programs that I was involved in. I did a university exchange in Sweden. I did a volunteer trip to India working with youth. Like it was a really amazing university for these sort of opportunities that I was seeking at the time.
Fascinating. So you spent a lot of your college time in other countries then, would you say?
Yes. So I was fortunate enough to get a scholarship at Macquarie University, and essentially I think most people spend the scholarship, they just sort of transfer the money over to paying for your courses. I didn't decide to do that, so I spent all my money that I had on the scholarship on traveling. So I would sort of do my 8 to 10 weeks of a semester, and then I would go traveling and then just keep repeating, rinse and repeat. And that's sort of how I got to traveling to almost 50 countries.
Hmm.
Was yeah, being able to study and then go and immerse myself in life and the world, and learn cultures and be
I
on the
see. So you
ground. And
weren't necessarily doing what we call here in the States, studying abroad programs, or a semester elsewhere, a semester, oh,
I
you
did
did
do
in
that
Sweden, you
once
mentioned.
in Sweden.
Yeah. But
Yes.
it sounds like most of the traveling you did was in between class, like
Yeah.
in
I
between.
in between semesters, and I think that's honestly what kept me to graduation. I really, honestly, I don't think I would have been able to stay in university for 5.5 years without having that option. I think I would have been a lot less fulfilled, and I don't
Yeah, the
think I would
traveling
have been.
fed your soul, right? And
Absolutely.
you stayed in school maybe because why do you think?
I stayed in school. Well, I mean, this is one of the more defining lessons in my life, was that when I first studied at university, I wanted to do sort of international law. I wanted to, like, again, coming back to this idea of humanitarian. And so I was like, maybe I can do some form of like humanitarian law. But when I moved down to Sydney in my second year of university, all of a sudden I was surrounded by all these people that valued status, power, and money. And that just, like, this little country girl that came from a small town all of a sudden had her eyes opened to these other values that people had, and I was very easily influenced. And so my direction kind of changed, and for those 4.5 years more, I started more focusing on, like, the status of being a lawyer, and the money that comes with this. And I kind of, to an extent, I guess, lost my way in that, which was really fascinating. And I think that's what I ended up realizing is, upon graduation, on my graduation day, I felt so lost. I felt so confused. I realized that I'd spent 5.5 years of my life studying something that I was not passionate about, or that I started in a passion and then I changed into something that was not my own value. And this was all sort of driven by this sense of inadequacy. I was really doing it because I liked the way that people received me. I liked the idea of being a lawyer and the title, and the receipt of that. So it was like really interesting experience for me to have, a very awakening experience for me to have, to realize that I'd found myself on another path that was not true to my authenticity.
How did you react to that at the time? It must have been a confusing mess of feelings, your
Yeah,
graduation day, and
absolutely.
feeling so unsettled inside.
Yeah, it was rough. I mean, because I think what had happened was, we had this such long-term goal that I had never thought about what actually happens when that goal is met. So I finally get there after 5.5 years and think, what's next? And I'm like, well, what's next after this is you go into a law firm, you become a lawyer, and then sort of that's your career path. But I didn't want to do that. And it was like, well, what am I doing here? Why did I spend so much time, energy, and focus doing this? So I went into law firms for a couple of years, and I went into then I changed into an executive assistant role to a CEO. And that was when really everything kind of came to its front, was that I was making a lot of money. I was being surrounded by sort of the rich, famous, wealthy of Australia. I had, a handsome boyfriend. Like, you have these boxes, right? The ideal life that you want to tick. And I was ticking them. And I was so depressed and anxious, just genuinely so unhappy, unfulfilled, lacked, ticking all those boxes right next to it.
Did that
Um,
surprise you at the time?
it surprised me in graduation, but I think because I persisted for a couple more years, because I was like, I can't let this go to waste, it then just, like, really, without me even realizing, went into this sort of dark place where I felt like I'd lost control of my life and myself. And I kind of, at that point in my life, I mean, it's kind of hard speaking from that point in my life because I've changed my mindset so much now. But at that point in my life, I truly felt like what I was experiencing was a life sentence. I felt like I was broken. I felt like my mind just wasn't working in the way that I needed to be, because I felt depressed and anxious. I really felt both at the same time. And that's a very dark hole to be in. and I couldn't see my way out at that time. So it
How
was
old were you
really,
then?
I would have been at 27. So I'm 33 now. So I would have been, so about 6 years ago. And so, you know, I'd have those days where I would wake up and I would just start crying. Like there would be half a second of like, I wake up and then it was like, bang, like I'm in it. And I started calling in sick because I just couldn't get myself out of bed. And I really beautifully a few days ago opened an old external hard drive and found a video from that time. For
I
some
heard
reason,
another conversation you did, and
yes.
I think I know what you're going to refer to, which
Yeah,
is
so
I'm always interested. There's a couple of things I want to look at with this, because
yeah,
the first thing I want to, before I forget, that
yes,
I want to unpack about this is, it sounds like you were blaming yourself for having these feelings. You said that you felt like you were
yeah,
broken, there was something wrong with
yeah,
you. Did you think that because externally I have all the things I'm supposed to
yes,
want, all the things that everybody wants, and I'm miserable? Is that okay?
yeah, absolutely.
Um,
I I thought I was ungrateful.
mm,
Like I thought that was my problem. I was like, how dare I? Like, look at
mm.
everything that I have and I am unhappy. Like, I thought that was like such a wrong thing to do.
When really, what was it? What
When
was the issue?
really a misalignment, it was
Mm,
a lack of authenticity.
mm,
But in saying that, like I didn't know who I was. I sought out a coach at this time. I think only one session, but it really changed my life. And the person said to me, like, who are you? And I answered, well, I am who I am. Like, who else would I be if I were not to be me? And in that moment, Eric, I was like, oh my God, like I'm not being who I am. Like
mm,
that's why. That's why I'm unhappy. That's why I'm anxious. That's why I'm depressed, because I'm living my life response to how people receive me versus like what is my truth.
mm.
And it was in that moment that I was like started this journey of, okay, I may not know what I want or who I am, but I know what I don't want and who I'm not. And that's a
That's
really
a
good
place to
starting
start.
place for me. Yeah.
It is,
And that
because
really started fueling the journey.
fascinating. So before I ask you, and I want to ask you what you did then with that
Yes.
awareness, but I'm always absolutely fascinated when I hear about people who do things or have experiences that to me are pretty out of the ordinary, right?
Mm,
And so, and sometimes that's because they take on a challenge that sounds,
mhm.
irrational or even crazy to people at large. Like those kinds of things are always interesting to hear about. But you did something that I think is pretty unique. I'm sure you're not the only person that's ever done it, but
Mhm.
and I think it was around this time. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you got out your camera,
Yeah.
maybe on your phone, and made a video recording of yourself while
Mm,
you were bawling, correct? Like
yeah.
you were having a crying attack and
Yeah.
you filmed it. So tell me about this and what the circumstances were and why you did that.
Yeah. So I woke up one morning and this was sort of just before everything shifted. And I couldn't pull myself out of bed. And I, wrote in sick and I just sat up against sort of like the back of my bed. And I just felt so low. And intuitively, I was like, I'm going to film this. Like, I don't completely know why right now, but
You
it
didn't
feels
have, like, you
right.
weren't a popular Instagrammer at this point or anything.
No,
You weren't
no,
doing this like,
it
I'm going to
certainly
be a
wasn't what I was
sensation on
sharing.
TikTok.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
We
if
might
it's
start a new
probably a
trend.
bit
Uh-oh.
cooler now. It wasn't cool at that point in time. But I pulled out my phone and as I was sharing sort of like only in the last few days, I actually found this video and watched it. It goes for about 5 minutes.
Wow.
Yeah, it's pretty confronting to see now as
Hmm.
the person that I've developed into. Um, but yeah, I was sitting in my bed and basically just saying like, I feel so out of control and I don't know how to like get out of this. And yeah, it's a very sort of melancholy. It's almost like I have not much energy. Like you kind of at the end, you're at your wit's end. And I was saying, you know, I've never been suicidal. I don't think that's sort of in my personality to ever be like that. But there's a part of me that's like, I don't understand the point of all of this. If this is what it is, I don't get it. Like it doesn't make sense to me that this is how my life is going to be. So it was good. There's like glimmers even towards the end. I kind of talk about like, I know.
Oh, so you're speaking in this video.
Yeah. I'm speaking for 5 minutes. Yeah.
Are you speaking through
about
tears
how
or
I'm
what's
feeling.
happening?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm crying.
What do you think was what was
the
the impulse to film it about, do you think? In that moment?
Well, I think it was more the intuition. It was just like, just do this. Like, I don't know why, just do this. And I feel like sort of in reflection of in coming across it recently is that I would love to share it in a contextual way with people, because I think, you know, when people come to you for coaching, for example, it can be sometimes difficult for them to understand that you've been in a similar place to them. Particularly now, you know, I'm very in control of my mindset. Fortunately, I'm a very happy person in my life. It doesn't mean that everything's perfect, but I certainly have the tools and experiences to be confident to move through that now. But that hasn't been the case always. So I think it's a beautiful, raw, real representation of where I was, and that people can connect to and understand that if you too feel that way, there is a way out. Because I think, as I shared earlier, like a way out
that isn't, you know, there is a way through maybe, as opposed to having to, you know, end your
because I felt like it was my life sentence. I genuinely like at that point in time, I genuinely thought, this is what my life will be. This is my life. This is who I am. Like, you know, I feel pretty crazy. Like I can't get a handle on things. I'm really reactive. This is my life. And like, it's interesting now to reflect on that that's genuinely what I believed, that was me for the rest of my life. And if someone wanted to be with a crazy character like that, then like, that's amazing.
Yeah. Well,
but
when
I'm
you're
not going to bank on it.
When you're in a state of anxiety and depression, then your thinking is not so clear, and it's pretty limited. And so that does not surprise me that you felt that way in that moment. I venture to say that most human beings, if you live long enough on this planet, you've probably had a similar experience where you felt absolutely hopeless about your situation. It's a very human, common thing. It's probably epidemic at this point in time on the planet. And so I think it would be incredibly generous of you, in the right context, to share that, especially given the changes that you've made and the person that you've become since, and to show people, to demonstrate that what sometimes feels like an impossible hole to get out of, you know, is not. And there are, you know, your fate isn't sealed to be this unhappy. But when you're in the grips, and that's what is so insidious about depression, is that when you're in the grips of it, there almost isn't room to take that in. Or it's really hard to take that in. So what
I will just add on that point, Eric. I think the biggest thing for me was that I identified it as me, like as a static thing. It was like, I am anxious, I am depressed, rather than like, I am experiencing anxiety and I can unexperience it. I think that was like one of the biggest things for me in seeing the contrast between the two now, is that I thought that like, that is me versus that is something that I'm experiencing.
Important distinction for sure.
Yeah.
What happened next?
So I ended up quitting my job, breaking up with my boyfriend, having to move, obviously, all those exciting things. It was a big moment in my life. I really just cut all ties with what I was doing in that moment. And it was pretty extreme. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. But it was what felt right for me at that time, was that sort of going back
Reboot.
to what I had shared is like, I didn't know what I wanted, but I knew that what I had was not working. And I was just going to kind of like clean slate it. So I ended up going back to Kenya for the 4th time. And unfortunately, there was some sort of trouble within the organization ethically for me that I had to sort of step aside in the first week. So everything that I'd been pulled to from such a young age, people I called family, all of a sudden that kind of changed within the week. That was a big week for me, obviously, in sort of coming from quitting my job and breaking up with my boyfriend and everything. And I remember a distinct moment where I was sort of on this lino cold floor, sort of cement floor in this old house in Kenya. And I just remember sort of being in the fetal position and just like crying, but in a very kind of like painful way. Like, I think, you know, some people might be able to relate to this. Just when you're in, like, your emotional pain is so deeply physical that it just feels so raw. That was the experience that I really had, because I felt so disconnected, isolated, lost. I just felt like I just didn't have my grip on anything. And I'd sort of left everything behind to come over to Kenya with this all falling apart as well. But I think, you know, I'm a big sort of believer that the universe will kind of reveal where you're not free. And it was the time for me to stop running away. It was the time for me to confront what I had left behind. You know, I love the saying, like, wherever you go, there you are. It was really that moment because I think, you know, for example, I'd moved out of home when I was 16, and I was really rewarded for leaving an environment and taking on my independence. That was like my reward. So I just kind of learned this pattern that at any point in your life when things get hard, running away from it sometimes works. But in this moment, it did not. In this moment.
Yeah. Can we back up a little bit
yeah.
You left home at 16?
Yes.
So what were the circumstances there? And, you know, what was your life like in between 16 and then when you first went to Kenya at 18? So what were those years about?
So I moved out of home at 16. At that point in time, my mom and I were just really not getting along. And it was a really interesting moment in life because, you know, you mentioned at the start that I'm a human connection specialist. And recently I've been really reflecting on, like, why is that? Why is it that I value connection, human connection so much? And at around 16, it was just this really kind of messy part of my life where I was sort of fighting with my mom, and I would sort of go see my dad, and then I'd fight with him. And I just remember this like one day where I kind of like left my dad's and like went up to the top of this hill, kind of overlooking like this beautiful greenery. It was like kind of like this really big, vast, expansive view. And I remember standing at the top of that and just at 16 years old, only child, fighting with both parents, and just being like, I feel on top of the world, but that I'm not connected to it. And it was just this kind of weird disorientation and disconnection. And it was a really lonely moment in my life. And I felt stuck. I felt like I didn't know the out in that. And what I came to learn and take on not too soon after that was, well, I'm at an age now where I can start taking more action and control of my life.
At age 16?
At age 16. Yeah. And so I chose to move out of home. And it was interesting, and maybe this is just part of my personality, but on that first night of living out of home, I felt like freedom. I felt this sense of inner peace I hadn't felt for so long. And like I laid on like a mattress on the floor, and I remember it so vividly. Like I don't think I even had sheets at that point in time. And I just sort of laid on that mattress and I just was like, oh, like I just went, oh. And I think such a defining moment in my life at such a young age, as I sort of shared, developed this pattern of whenever things get hard, you can leave them. You can leave them behind. But I think sort of moving to sort of this time in Kenya, it was a moment where, because I'm a believer that I'm a co-creator in universe, that like the universe was just like, okay, well, now's the time, 10 years later, that you need to start addressing these things because they're going to continue to follow you if you leave them untouched.
Yeah. And so what then? So in other words, you can't just run from your problems indefinitely.
Yeah.
What
So I did a very like eat, pray, love kind of thing. And this is before eat, pray, love was cool. I ended up, I mean, I had the choice to go back to Australia. It didn't feel right. So I literally went on Google and I Googled like most spiritual place in India. And I told myself before clicking search, whatever the place is that comes up, that is where I'm going. And so it was a place called Rishikesh. And I booked a ticket a couple of days later, left my suitcase and all my things in Kenya with a friend, took a really small backpack and headed over to India. And that began sort of 2 months of a deeply spiritual, self-exploratory journey. I spent a few weeks in India regrouping and sort of listening to spiritual teachers. And then I gathered a group of 8 strangers together who were in India for a various sorts of reasons, doing their own sort of self-exploration. And I organized for us to go to Nepal, and we ended up trekking for 6 weeks in a couple of different trails, all together, all going through our different stuff. And it was just...
Were these people from all over the world or?
All over the world, Australia, America, New Zealand. And
similar age, or was there a range?
A range probably between 22 to 35. So we were all sort of like different genders, different nationalities, different experiences. And it was beautiful. It was, I'm nostalgic for that time in my life regularly because it was so free. It was just like we kind of did whatever we wanted. We came together. We went to Nepal. We're trekking in the foothills of the Himalayas, just like every day getting up and trekking like 10 to 20 kilometers, and like the snow is falling in places and you're going to beautiful like temples. And it was just such a beautiful time in my life to really create space just to process the pain that, I spoke of in Kenya, that sort of emotional, physical pain, to start discharging what I was sort of carrying for so long.
So it was sort of a spiritual pilgrimage in a sense to yourself, right?
Yes, it really was.
And what came from that? Did you have any realization or epiphany or insight from having done that?
I think it just kind of goes back to this theme of connection. Like when I was out there, I was yearning for it so much, and I was kind of like looking to the mountains, and I'm like recognizing what I'm a part of. But it just kept reminding me that like in order to kind of feel connected with life and nature and people, I had to do the work in connecting with myself. And I think that was one of the biggest lessons at that time, was I didn't realize how deeply I was living in self-rejection. It was such a subconscious thing that I was really like pushing parts of me away and trying to suppress them. And it was kind of availing that opportunity to be like, well, if you're here in this element of exploration and you're trying to understand who you are and what you want, you're going to have to stop pushing down things and let things come up and let things start flowing and becoming more aware. So I think at that point in time, like that was a lot for me. But it was the realization that of how much self-rejection I was experiencing, which I think to an extent is just kind of ingrained by society. It was kind of like revealing these layers that had been with me for so long. And in starting to be comfortable in expressing what feels right for me versus me showing up in this persona of what I think people will like of me.
What specific parts of yourself do you think, looking back, were you rejecting?
I just think going back to this element of feeling out of control, I just kind of felt like I didn't really like myself a lot. I was really frustrated with myself. You know, you share about this like element of high achieving. I was like, well, why can't I get this like emotional centeredness right? Like, what is wrong with me? As I sort of shared with you earlier, Eric, it was like this element of like thinking I was broken. I was just like, like it was like, it was that frustration of not being able to pull it together, to pull myself together. And all this expectation and judgment that came with that. So it was kind of this like
Judgment from yourself?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
demands that you were making of
All
yourself.
self-expectation, self-judgment. It was all this self-inflicted pain that now I can be aware of. But I wasn't always aware of that. It just kind of felt like my life experience. I didn't know at that point, you know, I wasn't a mindset coach back then. I didn't know how to separate it all. It just felt like this big ball of an experience that was really like a roller coaster and painful and all over the place. And just coming into recognizing that so much of that was because I could not find my own sense of inner peace within me, that I was looking externally to try and make things better when, you know, the quote unquote problem was my relationship with myself.
Yeah. How did you go about beginning to repair that and to reconnect with yourself and to be kinder to yourself?
Well, I think, as you sort of just shared, I think just starting to practice that element of like, be kind to yourself. Like,
Yeah, but it sounds, obvious enough, but
right.
to actually practice it and to actually
Yeah.
internalize it is a completely different thing.
Well, I think it was almost like, I think things had gotten so bad that it was almost that point that it was like, you can keep living your life like this, but it will continue to be like this.
So
And
I hear a certain amount of surrendering.
absolutely, it was really like, I'm on the edge and I have a choice. I can like push myself over the edge, or I can start taking a step back and start mending and healing what has been hurtful in my life. Which is, yeah, certainly something that it takes time. I still do it. I think it's a daily practice. I think these things aren't just an overnight, like, oh, I'm going to be kind to myself. Well, that's done and dusted.
Done.
But it's recognizing my responsibility in all of this and taking my power back. And I think that's been one of the biggest things, is like, that's like where I live from now on a daily basis. And that's why I'm so happy and fulfilled and have meaning and connection and fulfillment in my life, is because like I take my power back and I know how to experience all those things from the way in which like my perspective is in my life versus thinking that external circumstances need to be changed for that.
Yeah. And that's a big realization. And as you pointed out, it's an ongoing practice.
Yeah.
But it's a very obviously empowering one, and it's a life-changing one when you
Yeah.
realize that the answers aren't external per se, that
Yeah.
because the world is never going to be in your control. I mean,
Right.
you can try to line up all the pieces just the way you want them, and maybe for a moment in time they will be lined up, but then life takes over and things
Yeah.
happen. We've if we haven't learned that lesson from COVID, I don't know what what will drive that home, right? So at some
Mhm.
point it becomes about learning how to find peace from within and find some kind of agency from within, and not
Yes.
have our self-worth tied up in the external aspects of our life, our job title,
Yes.
our status, or whatever else, the way things appear, our appearance, right?
Yes.
um, you've mentioned several times, I've heard you talk about the word you've used is free. You felt free, or you weren't feeling free.
Mm.
And I've heard you elsewhere mention this particular quote that comes from, I didn't know this person, Peter Crone.
Mm.
Life will present you with people and circumstances, and you've said a version of this. Life will present you with people and circumstances to reveal where you're not free.
Yeah.
That's a fascinating quote,
Mm.
and I would love to hear you just sort of expound upon that. Talk about maybe how and why this quote resonates with you,
Mm.
and what you think is meant by the word free in that quote. Life presents you with people and circumstances to reveal where you're not free. What does it mean to be free?
Well, I think, to be free for me is to be able to sort of like experience a state of like inner peace, no matter the
Hmm.
circumstance, is to really be centered, no matter the circumstance, and to feel connected with who you truly are in all your essence. Like that to me personally is when I feel the most free. It's to not be controlled by external circumstance, to not be reactive to external things. The quote that you shared, the reason why I love it is because I used to experience quite a lot of triggers, emotional triggers in my life. And I would really feel, going back to this consistent theme in our conversation of not being in control, kind of like really frustrated, like, oh, here we go again on this roller coaster of being triggered today. And it was just like, felt like I was being hit
Hmm.
from side to side all the time. And just like, I didn't know how to change that. Hence this idea of like, well, this is my life sentence. I'm just going to keep on bouncing through life and hitting the wall. That quote, and particularly Peter Crone's teachings, I highly recommend people go and check him out, was probably the most profound quote for me in my life, because it taught me that in life, people, circumstances, whatever triggers you is an opportunity for you to free yourself from whatever that binds you to that trigger. And
Can you
so
give an example? I mean, a personal example, perhaps,
um
or it doesn't have to be a personal example, but just something that um, takes it out of being an abstract concept
well,
to it.
yeah, like I think, I think relationships are a great one for this. So say, for example, in older relationships, if someone upset me, that's their fault.
Hmm.
But now I take responsibility for why has this upset me. I used to be upset if people, for example, okay, say someone calls me not a good person. That was a big one for me, a big belief that I had to move through. If someone said, hey, Jennah-Louise, like, you're not a good person, that used to really trigger me.
Someone would say that
And
to you? Seriously?
Yeah. Family. Yeah.
Of course.
Going back to
Wow.
family.
Ouch.
That was a big one for me. The only recently I've been able to move through, but sort of I use that example because past me, that would hurt a lot. That would I would really feel that. And it's kind of like this cool contrast is like, say if someone was like, hey, Jennah-Louise, like, you're a purple elephant. I'd be like, what? Like, that's ridiculous. No, I'm not. Like, no, really, Jennah, like, you're a purple elephant. I'm like, no, I don't agree with that at all. Oh, but you're not a good person. And I'd be like, oh,
yeah. So in other
not?
words, there was something in you that was agreeing with that.
Something in me that believes that.
Yeah.
Words can only hurt you if you believe them. That was really big for me. Wow. Because again, it's coming back to that relationship with yourself. This isn't about what this person is saying about you. This is about how you're receiving it. And that was like, that's been so big for me, for that, those ideas of those triggers in your life that you're binding yourself to. That was an element of where I lacked freedom. I associated myself with not being a good person. And at any point that someone said that about me or insinuated that, it triggered me. Because of that belief, I had behavioral adaptations of people pleasing, for example. Because I had that belief, that means I'm not free, because I'm spending my day trying to make sure that everybody else is okay before myself. These manifest in our daily lives. So yeah, sort of coming back to that idea, I think it's so potent and powerful, is if you are triggered by people or circumstances in your life, start becoming aware, start asking, like, reflect, start asking the question, why is this bringing something up in you? What are you saying about yourself for this to trigger something within you? And take responsibility in that. And sometimes it can be so deeply ingrained that it's so raw and it's a little ugly and it's painful. But these things, like, you know, we go back to this idea of freedom, in being able to work through them, in being able to process them and let them go, you're closer to that sense of freedom.
I love that. And yeah, I mean, I think that you could substitute inner peace really with freedom in that context. That's where inner peace lies, in not being held captive by our own reactivity, by being able to dismantle it, by being able to not take things personally, and to take things to use either other people's words or our own against ourselves. It's like a Jedi mind trick to be able to pull that off consistently, but it is doable, I think. And also I think the message, at least speaking from my own experience, is, you know, I love the expression progress, not perfection. So every time that you're able to pause, doesn't have to be, you don't have to be perfect at it, but every instance in which you are able to pause and take a breath and then choose how you wish to respond rather than simply do it reactively, that's a win. That's a huge win. And you may not be able to do it every single time, but when in those moments, if you can just simply increase the frequency of them, I mean, that's huge, right?
Absolutely. And it's that element of self-compassion. You come back to this idea of being kind to yourself. Give yourself space.
Revolutionary, by the way. It's a revolutionary. It is.
Really. It's life-changing. Being able to avail yourself the space to have compassion, that you're not going to always show up, as you're saying, in perfection, but to understand that just that power of pause and that awareness is progress in itself.
And to be able to treat yourself the way you would treat someone else that you deeply care about or love. I mean, it's
the easiest thing, isn't it? When we just kind of reframe it like that.
Well, you know, it's easy to do for other people.
Like, no, of course not. Well, why are you speaking to yourself like that? And this is where it comes back to that theme of self-rejection. We're just so used to beating the shit out of ourselves, and we normalize it and we don't even recognize it. So I love that you mentioned that, because it's such a quick way of going, well, treat yourself like you would to a little child. Like it
takes practice. I personally was found, if you're familiar with the practice of loving kindness, the meditation practice, I would highly recommend to anyone listening this. I found this to be extremely helpful. And in a moment, it can be extremely healing. You can, personally really love the work of Jack Kornfield, and he has guided meditation recordings you can listen to that are specific. The practice is known as, sometimes it's called metta or loving kindness. And but find whichever version works for you. So the person's voice has a lot to do with it. Some we get turned on or off by a particular voice, and we don't let the message it through. So, but the practice of loving kindness has Buddhist origins, and it's a deliberate sitting practice, and I recommend doing this with a guide. Even a recording is fine, where you hold thoughts of loving kindness. And there's different ways you move through it. First, you can direct them. You can think of someone that you care about, that it's very easy and natural for you to feel that way about. Eventually, you do direct those feelings inwardly to yourself. It can be profound. And ultimately, though, you're guided through, and the goal is to increase that circle of compassion that you're able to feel. So it starts with like a very small circle of just like the people you most know and are easy, that it comes most easily to you to care about and extend these compassionate feelings toward. And then you just broaden it and broaden it and broaden it. And then you take like someone that's really challenging, really pushes your buttons really hard, but you try. You may succeed in that moment, you may not. And ultimately, like it builds to holding that space and compassion for all sentient beings everywhere. And you can do this as a practice. You'll have different experiences on different days, but I have personally found that to be very helpful and transformational, and a really valuable tool in developing kindness towards myself, which I've certainly had. That's been a long journey to get there for me. There are a couple more things I would love to ask you about, if you're willing. So I know that one facet of you is this endurance athlete. And I'm curious to know where, you did mention that as a kid, you were naturally athletic and outdoorsy, right? So did this start from a young age? And I'd love to hear just about your journey as your journey in the world of endurance athleticism, shall we say.
Yeah, really, it's so relevant to everything that we've been speaking about. I did grow up, I did surf life saving, as I shared, for 11 years. So,
what was that called?
Surf life saving, it's called here in Australia. So it's sort of like swimming and board riding and running on the beach, in the sand and in the water. It's a really beautiful lifestyle. So I did that for 11 years, and I would do it 6 to 7 days a week. So I was really, really active, getting up really early before school and going after school and things like that. And then it sort of all came to a close when I was around this time, 16. The competition was getting too intense, and I just kind of like dropped it to the wayside.
So this was an organized activity that was it done through school, or was it associated through school or outside of school?
So like we have like state championships, there's like a world championships. So you do competition in it.
I see.
It's seasonal, so it's more around summer. But it's very active, very fit lifestyle, very healthy lifestyle, really beautiful being able to grow up in that space. But when I stopped that, I kind of continued to run, but playing into our earlier conversation, I really continued to run as a mental outlet. I always felt like if I didn't run, I wouldn't feel as clear or centered as I normally would if I ran. So it was kind of this release of energy that I would continually kind of build up throughout my day. And so sort of going through my 20s, I kind of was just doing that very casually. And then I sort of started moving into sort of military inspired events, which were kind of 12-hour, 6-hour, 24-hour events, endurance events, that really played with the mind and body in different ways, were really fun. But I really felt pulled towards that. And I think it was the element of expanding my potential, seeing what's possible, working with other people in that, doing hard things together. I just love that element.
I love that you use the word fun, because I can imagine a lot of people listening and thinking that's not my idea of fun. Yeah, but no,
I
it's
would challenge, give it a try.
yeah, it's true. I kind of went down that road mostly in my 30s and early 40s, very unpredictably. I never would have guessed. I got kind of sucked into that world where I started very gradually. I literally started with just riding my bike to the beach back and forth and really enjoying it, and then getting curious about doing a very short distance triathlon. And then once you get
Beautiful.
sucked into that world, I mean, it's unbelievable. And it's part of
Yeah.
what's fascinating about it
It
is
is really that sucking in.
yeah, like, you know, it becomes, I would call it, I mean, anything done to an extreme, I suppose, can be harmful, but I saw it in my case as sort of like a sort of a positive addiction. Like,
Yeah,
and
totally.
like yourself, I was very much captured by, first of all, it's enjoyable to exercise and get that endorphin release, and it's a healthy outlet, and it feels good to feel good and be healthy. So the activities in and of themselves, swimming, biking, and running, I genuinely
Yeah.
enjoyed.
Yeah.
But this idea of pushing yourself and being able to explore what is possible, and to whenever you are able to do something that you previously thought an earlier version of you literally would have dismissed as that's not possible, or that's not possible for me, and then you've done it. It is
Yeah.
a quite an empowering experience, and it gets you curious about what other things, what other ways have I been limiting myself? What other things might be
Yes.
possible for me? So I
Yes.
personally identify with the fun. I mean, it's that's not all it is, but
No.
I can identify with that. Now, what was in the introduction, I mentioned this 24-hour military inspired
Yes.
event, and you were the only female finisher of this event.
Yeah, so I've done it twice. The first one I
What is it
did,
called?
um, I forget what it was specifically, like the title of it, but
Hmm.
it's a 24-hour in like military inspired endurance event. So essentially for 24 hours you're in this event, and it's just like 24 hours essentially nonstop of like push-ups, sit-ups, running out in the cold water, carrying boats, carrying 20 kilos on your back, carrying like a metal bar.
Do you know in advance, like, is there a structure to like, do you know
No,
what you do?
that that's part of, well, I mean,
Wow.
you have an idea that that's the mix of things, but they don't specifically tell you what you will
Oh,
do, because that's a big element of it, is this mental element. So it's a lot of
wow.
like yelling, it's a lot of like, only speak when you're spoken to.
Yeah, I don't know that I
You
would
don't
use the
know
word
when
fun to describe that, but
it's pretty intense. I will
yeah.
certainly say that, but I thrive in it. I don't
Mhm.
essentially know why, but I love it. Like, love
Interesting.
it. When I am like in it, I love it so much. It's hard. It's certainly one of the more difficult things I did. But what I found so interesting, Eric, in that first one that I did, because there were a lot of people that started. I think closer to 30 people that started, and I think there was like 11 finishers or something. And as shared, me being the only female finisher, but we would get to the 22-hour mark
Mm.
and people were pulling out,
Mhm.
and that used to fascinate me.
Mhm.
Just the difference, right? And like, you're so close, hang on, like you're gonna have a nice sleep and all the food tonight. You're gonna wake up tomorrow regretting that stuff.
Yeah,
But I always
the
found that
mental
the mental
aspect,
so
it is
powerful.
truly fascinating.
Yes.
And anyone that's ever trained for an event, an endurance event, a marathon, what have you, uh, will have experienced the mental component of the training, and the ways, I personally think it's a very individualistic thing, as because motivation
Mm,
is very individual.
mm,
Understanding how to motivate yourself varies person to person. The things that,
yes.
some people, for instance, are extremely motivated by competition, and especially
Yeah.
in those kind of contexts, right? Like, they find it motivating. Oh, the other guy's going to beat me. I got to go. I'm not that way. So that I don't care. That personally isn't motivating to me per se. But I find my own reserves of, and it's an incredible thing when you can tap into resources you didn't even realize that you have, and you do that, especially, I think, in the context of an event, when it's like,
Yeah.
it's sort of do or die, and it counts. It's the real thing.
Mhm.
There's stakes are high, but even in the course of training, You develop ways of figuring out how to push yourself through the difficult spots, and how to, like, again, it's the mental aspect of the training. It's equally, if not more important than the physical. They
Yes,
go hand in hand, but
absolutely.
it is truly, and I think I can relate in part, at least, to why you get so much out of that, is because
Yeah.
it's powerful to really, how many people ever, unfortunately, if these are contrived circumstances. I mean, sometimes we don't know how we're going to deal with things until we're tested by life, and people go through horrific
Yeah.
things and learn that way. But this is a bit of a more controlled environment, and it's a you're there by choice, and
Yes.
you're there in part to really test your limits, and to test yourself, and to see if you can access deep reserves
Yes.
of strength, mental and physical,
Yes.
within yourself, that you otherwise would never experience. You would never really,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah, I
Is that?
absolutely, you were on it. Absolutely. And I mean, I love that you brought that up, because I ended up doing this same event a second time, but I did not train for it. So I
Oh,
trained for the first one.
was
The
that
second
cockiness, or
one,
what was that?
no. So by then I knew the people running the event, and they ended up messaging me the day before saying someone's pulled out.
Oh,
If
I
you'd
see.
like a spot, feel free. And I was like, hey, I'll go, like, give that a go again. um Brutal. Absolutely brutal. By the
Big
third
difference,
hour
training, not training. Oh,
I had
huge.
been sick. Like, it was on the third hour I was like in the dark, and I had 21 more hours to go. But I stayed in it, and that was like, and I finished. But that
Oh,
was
wow.
such, like, the beautiful lesson in that is that, like, endurance, it ebbs and flows. And 1 minute you are in, like, that really element of pain, and you think you can't take one more step and you're done. And then if you just kind of stay the course and recenter, you're back in it. And it was just a beautiful lesson that I could have given up on that 3 hours, and I didn't. And this one was bad. Like, I was starting to fall asleep at certain times. Like, I was not prepared physically. But that strength of that, like, mental fortitude, and just telling myself, like, I will finish, I can do this, like, just absolute certainty, conviction,
Hmm.
is what pulled me through. It wasn't my
It probably
physical
helped that
fitness.
you had done it before, so that you
Absolutely.
knew that you had
It
it in
was
you. You knew it
possible.
was possible, right?
Absolutely.
One of the
Yeah.
things that's so fascinating about this world of endurance athletes, and I know that you've interviewed many on your show, and that
Yeah.
is going to be a wonderful transition into our final topic that I want to talk
Yes.
about, which is your podcast. But before we go there, this, um, when you step into this world of, let's call it endurance races,
Mm.
there are extremes within extremes within extremes, and
Yes.
it's hilarious, because if you're new to that world and you step inside it, and maybe you're doing an event maybe you're doing like your first marathon or something, and for
Mm-hmm.
you this is like kind of an insane thing to do. For you, this is compared to, like, especially, I grew up in Philadelphia on the East Coast here in the US, and not known for physical fitness and health. I mean, it's like sort of known for its incredibly unhealthy foods, and the environment I
Mm.
grew up in. And I was not an athletic kid, and so from the context in which I grew up, doing even just a short distance triathlon, which was the first event that I did, was like a crazy extreme, what are you thinking kind of thing to do for
Yeah.
me, right, at the time.
Yeah.
But then when you step into that world and you start learning about the things that other people are doing or have done, and
Mm.
it's almost limitless, and you think, well, like, we each have our own notion at any given point in time where that line is drawn between, well, that's, not so bad, and that's, you're insane, like,
Yeah.
you need it, like, psychological help to think that you're doing something like that by choice. And it's fascinating to me. Well, I think what counts is that you start where you are, and you
Mm.
challenge yourself in a way that's meaningful to you. So there's this phenomenon, you perhaps heard about, like couch to 5K, these
Yeah.
sort of programs where people learn to become physically active when they haven't been. And for them, it's a
Mm,
massive transformation doing a 5K when they've been living a sedentary lifestyle and have not
yeah.
had any experience of, physical, vitality. To accomplish a 5K is huge, and it should not be discounted. And we shouldn't compare, you know, these things. But what's
Yeah.
fascinating to me is the relativity of the extreme things that human beings will willingly seek out and challenge themselves to
Yeah.
do. But it really is relative to where you're at. And,
Yes.
I think you want to find that sweet spot of challenging yourself, not doing something that's completely like unreasonable to ask of yourself from given the point at where you're starting. But
Hmm.
there's this term I love called eustress, EUSTRESS, which refers to like if we don't have enough stress in our lives, that's bad because
Yeah.
then we don't have anything like pushing us and we sort of stagnate. But
Right.
obviously what most people are more familiar with is having too much stress, and that does not
Yes.
bring out the best in us either. But there's a
Mm,
sweet spot in there and that's what that eustress refers to. And that's that amount of stress that pushes you and is giving you a sense of engagement with what you're doing, and you're
yes.
you're you're pushing your comfort zone, and you're growing, and you're rising to a challenge, and you're thriving in that space of stress. Anything more than that is too much. Anything and then
Right.
less than that is like
Yeah.
not enough. But that
Hmm.
sweet spot of, and you have to find, you don't have to, but I think it's extremely helpful if you want to grow, is to find those areas in which you can create that for yourself and
Yes.
rise to the challenge.
And understand that like everybody starts somewhere. Like I used to run sort of an average of 4 kilometers every time I would go out for a run. And this only goes back 4 years ago.
Wow.
And now I run ultra marathons.
Oh my goodness. And
So like I ran 100 kilometers in one day last year, and I'm
so
aiming
for
to
for us
run
Americans out there, that's 62 miles. 100
62
kilometers is
miles.
62 miles. Yeah. So you did
And
that in how much time? Like it was, you had one
well,
day, you said?
it was in the mountains, so it was about 19 hours in sort of, it was, yeah, pretty up and down. But I'm trying to do that this year on a quicker speed and expand my potential that way. But I have my longest single stage run in December that is 160 kilometers, so 100 miles, which sounds a lot, which it is. But the reason why I mention this is because I started at running 4 kilometers at a
Yeah.
time. And so, if you didn't grow up doing sport, that doesn't mean that, almost going back to the theme of when we we're talking about my relationship with my father and I at the start, like just because things have been a certain way does not mean that they have to continue like that.
Mm.
There is always a moment where you can make a decision to change the trajectory of your life, no matter what the age. I will highlight that because particularly in endurance ultramarathon running, there are some oldies and goldies out there that are just absolute phenomenal athletes. Some people picking it up in their 60s. Never too late to start. I'm a big advocate for it. So I
One
do think that if you're thinking, I can't do that, or that's not me, to just, as you're suggesting, just start and see where
start.
the journey takes you. See if you enjoy it, see if it's pulling you, and continue to expand from there.
I love what you said. You said it so beautifully about, what it's the opposite of the life sentence
Right.
mentality. It's that just
Absolutely.
because something was, that does not mean it has to stay that way. And there,
Right.
change is possible, growth is possible,
Yes.
progress is possible, happiness is possible. Really,
Anything is possible.
yeah. One of my favorite episodes that I've watched of your podcast is with Nita Sweeney.
Oh,
Speaking
she's
of,
beautiful. Yeah.
yeah, and her example, I think is massively inspiring. I
Yes.
encourage anyone listening to check it out right as soon as you're done listening to this. Really, because her story in many ways, both in terms of dealing with deep depression, and
Yeah.
also just making a radical lifestyle change in the name of better health at a
Yes.
pretty mature age when she got
Yes.
started. I don't know exactly how old she was, but her story is absolutely inspiring beyond belief. And your interview with her was magnificent. I really give you
Oh,
big
thank you.
props for that. And let's as a final topic of discussion for
Yes.
this, if you're game, I would love to ask you about your podcast. And I
Yes, would love
really
that.
am a sincere fan of this podcast.
Thank
I
you.
mentioned the episode with Anita Sweeney, and another one that I would mention as a go-to for listeners, or which one do I listen to first? Because there's so many. Um, Also, Miriam Lancewood,
Oh, she's
that
yeah,
episode is another mind blower and an
she's
incredible,
fantastic.
yeah. And they're very different, by the way, Nita and
They are.
Miriam, very different stories, but both very, very fascinating and inspiring people
Yes.
and interviews. You did a tremendous job with each of them. So,
Thank you.
so your podcast is called To Be Human.
Yes.
And how did this get started? Let's start there. How did you decide I'm gonna start a podcast, and what was your thinking going into it?
I love this question. um, so I started this podcast because I had a deep fear of self-expression. I sort of, we've covered this in our conversation. I grew up only child, very much head in the books and writing. I was a very internal person, so to speak. And sort of over the years, I developed this fear of sharing my thoughts so I could write them down, but in sharing them with other people was something that I was scared of. And I kind of starting to do more of this self-development work in mindset coaching over the last few years, particularly, I noticed how strong that was still. And there was still that sort of part of me, that investigative journalist part of me from a little girl that just loved having conversations with people and loved learning about people. And this fear was holding me back from doing something that I really, really loved. I was always really good at having one-on-one conversations, sort of intimate conversations, but to put myself out in front of the world in that, I was very afraid of. So during COVID, I sort of had great time for reflection during those couple of years. And I just kind of came to a point where I was like, if I were to get to the end of my life, this would be a regret. Like,
Wow.
this would absolutely be a regret if I did not do this. Like, I feel it. I feel it now. I feel the regret.
Wow. You feel the version of you that didn't go down this path yet.
Yes. Yes, I feel on the deathbed being like, should have started that podcast. So I bit the bullet and I started, and I would say at least for the first 10 episodes, like I was so afraid before every episode. I could feel like my heart beating. I was like anxious. And like it was a real personal journey for me to move through, and a very exposing one, because it wasn't like I was doing this behind closed doors. These things are recordings that are out sort of on YouTube and Apple and Spotify. But I've done I think just over 70 now, and
It's incredible.
it's beautiful. Like I honestly, Eric, like I have moments where I'm like, thank you, Jennah-Louise. Like, thank you for doing that. I'm so grateful that that first day you had the courage, like you showed up, you pressed record, you published it. And now you're at over 70, and it's like I see myself continuing for years to come. And I think it's a beautiful story in that. I think sometimes, particularly with podcasting, for example, people that are listeners, they almost put you on a pedestal to some extent. You're the podcast host, but I'm so passionate. This is part of the podcast, is like just humanizing people and being able to be like, yeah, I have a podcast. I've interviewed all these amazing people and I will continue to, but like, I'm on the other side of this, having my own personal experience of growth in being comfortable in sharing who I am and what I'm curious about, and asking questions and sharing my life. I think it's just been such a beautiful part of my journey that I'm so grateful for.
All right. I'm trying to figure out what to say next. The first thing that comes to mind is that as a listener, one would never know. And that there's a
Interesting.
important message in that, I think, is, we see people,
That is.
we see people's exteriors, we see their outward
Yeah.
presentations in the world. We have no idea what's going on with them.
Yes.
And, you know, also measuring accomplishments in how and why and how they're meaningful to you. So in other words, what might be so not a big deal for someone else, if it took courage for you, if you had to, face a fear in order to do something, then for you, it's the equivalent of, a massive accomplishment. It isn't, it's not the equivalent. It is a massive accomplishment. And that's called growth. That's personal growth. That's like feeling great about yourself, overcoming a fear in the name of doing something that's meaningful to you and important to you.
Yes.
And whatever that is, if that's a 5K you've never done, then beautiful. And see, again, the external metrics are such that like people like, you just see like these are people's accomplishments or these blah, 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 but we don't have no idea what their, unless they share with us, we don't know what their internal journey was like, what their experience is like. There's so many, world-class performers in multiple arenas that are still to this day, they're terrified with stage fright.
Yes.
I remember in your conversation with Dean Karnassus, he talked about how he's an introvert and he gets like nervous when he has to do these interviews. Like Dean Karnassus, like,
I know.
and I've seen him speak, and he's so gregarious, and he seems so at ease with people and so warm and friendly.
Right.
He's a human being, and that's the whole point of your show, right? But it was just hilarious to hear that, like, you don't think of him as being meek or intimidated or afraid in any way. And he's a human being. So of course he, has these, we all share that range of emotional, there's like a spectrum of emotions that we all as humans have access to, and different things might trigger different emotions for different people. But, we all have those experiences. And
that was a big reason why, like a big purpose behind the podcast is, in my bio of that, it talks about humanizing high performers for that very reason. One, to be able to provide a safe space for high performers to show up and be seen, because I think there isn't always a safe space for that. They have to sort of put up this mask or this persona of who they are to kind of hold the respect and hierarchy that they have, the status. But two, to be able to share with the listener, for them to see themselves in people that they look up to, and to understand that, it's like your example with Dean Karnassus is like, okay, like I can't be Dean because like, he's so good, like with his public like outlook, and like he gets up and does speeches and he goes on news television and all this stuff. And it's like, but he's fearful and he's moving through his own limitations, and that you are capable of. And I think that's such a beautiful, powerful lesson. Something that's certainly helping me in my life is the more high performers I meet and the more I humanize them, it gives me more motivation and openness to what I can achieve, because I just see that they're just like me, but they're taking action despite of those fears.
Beautiful. And you already answered a question I was going to ask you, which is what have you learned from, you've done, let's say, call it 70 interviews. And by the way, I took note of this. You published the podcast trailer and the very first episode of your show on the same day, that same date, which was May 27th of 2021. So you're only, a year plus a couple of months into this journey.
Wow.
And you've recorded 70 interviews. Is that right? That's
probably more. I've got probably like 15 not published.
Oh my
I'm the one that edits them all.
That's
slow on the editing. I like talking over editing.
Me too. It's oh my goodness. Well, as a newbie to this space, I'm much greener than you with podcasting, but I can really appreciate how much work that represents. And I've seen also the way that you do, the job that you do. I mean, people could, I suppose, just show up and just do an interview and record it and publish it. And not that there's anything wrong with it. That's one approach. But like myself, I see the care that you put into each show. I mean, you read their books, you think very thoughtfully about what you want to ask them. You're also very present during the interview and, responsive to that. And the way you do more work at editing wise than I do, and just in terms of polish and presentation with your music, with your pulling a quote, from the interview out and putting it up front, and all the little details, like this all takes a lot of time and work and thought to do, and not to mention courage and nerve. So I give you a lot of props. And also you do a really fantastic job. Are there any particular favorite interviews that you would have people listen to if they, I mentioned a couple, but are there any, that you would direct people to get a taste of your podcast, or things that, ones that you're particularly proud of?
Oh gosh. Ooh. Well, I think I would certainly second the Miriam Lancewood one. That's certainly one of my personal favorites. She is a phenomenal person. And certainly in that conversation, she shares some very powerful takeaways that you can reflect on and that can be quite life-changing if you choose to be. Her conversation certainly stuck with me. Other than that, gosh, it's so hard because I think, my podcast is so varied. So it depends what your personal interest is. True. Obviously, as an endurance enthusiast, I would recommend any of them that are, Dean Cananzas, for example, any of those ones that are focused on the endurance mindset. I think it's such a powerful mindset to have because you can bring that into your everyday life, which I think can be very amazing. Gosh, I can't even all of them.
They're going to have to just listen to all of them. It's that
you don't have to listen to all of them, but I think they're all so different, and I'm in flow with some people a lot more than others, and I think that my bias would be that those ones are probably better. But I think from the start, in my introduction, I try and put some thought into the introduction so what you're sort of being set up for. So by all means, you can always just listen to the introduction.
Yeah, that's true. And
calls on you.
But I think people might be surprised, like they might not think they're going to be interested in a particular topic.
Yes.
And that's why I asked you to, if you had
be more specific.
Well, just because you might not be interested. You think, I don't care about endurance races. That doesn't interest me. But the personal story behind, might be fascinating. It might have some really relevant takeaways for you. That's why I asked the question.
I love one just popped into my mind. I love Sarah Lindley's. I think it was in the first 5 that I did, I think. And laughing about podcasting for 15 minutes of the first bit of the audio was bad, so I had to re-say it myself. So that's a bit of a laugh, but she is such an amazing speaker. She speaks.
What is her name again?
Sarah Lindley.
Okay.
So she's a 2-times world champion triathlete, and she is a speaker for Tony Robbins at his events. And she is just she just actually overcame cancer. Her life is just like she is amazing, and her storytelling's amazing. So I would certainly recommend that one if you can deal with my first 10 minutes of me speaking for her. Then you can really get into what she shares, which I think she's personally someone just in my own personal life. I've done her mastermind. I've done group coaching with her. She's profoundly changed my life in her energy that she shows up in her authenticity. So I'd definitely recommend that one as well.
Awesome. Thanks so much. You've already touched on these, but I'll just ask these questions again, just to further, see what other gems I can kind of squeeze out of this. And selfishly, again, as I said, I'm newer to the podcasting arena. So what I'm curious about would be as follows, and you can decide in which order you want to answer these or to what extent you want to answer these. But I'm interested in hearing about, your growth through these 70 plus interviews of podcasting. Specifically, what have been the big takeaways from interviewing all of these high achieving people in different arenas? If there are any either patterns that have emerged or things that have most called out to you. You already touched on that a bit with talking about
Mm-hmm.
how seizing inspiration from the fact that they're normal people just like everyone else, and
Yeah.
what can I do? And I think it's really important to drive home that it's not our job to be Dean Karnassus. It's not our job to be
Yeah.
Nita Sweeney. It's our job to be Jennah-Louise Salkeld in your case, or Eric Teplitz in my case.
Mm-hmm.
You want to realize your own potential. You're not trying to copy someone else or live their life or journey. You're
Yes.
trying to be inspired by all means by them and their
Mm-hmm.
stories, but do what you're called to do and be the best version
Yes.
of you that you can be, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious to know if there are any big takeaways from the interviews themselves, and then also just from the journey of doing doing these 70 interviews and putting yourself out there each time. Are you any less nervous now when you record interviews? And what other growth or changes has the experience of podcasting? How has it manifested for you thus far?
So I think on my podcast, my final question that I ask everybody is, what does it mean to you to be human? So I think, a beautiful pattern to highlight amongst these high performers and high achievers is the way in which they answer that. And of course, they're distinctly different in their own unique expression, but there are patterns that have formed. And a common one is just kind of being able to embrace the spectrum of emotion by virtue of being human that we experience. So not necessarily labeling emotions as negative or positive or ones we want or don't want, but being able to be open to experiencing them all when they come to us is a consistent theme that I think is really beautiful. Another one is really being able to explore our potential and expand that, which I think is really beautiful. Like a big purpose in life is to do that. And when we do that, what comes with that, which is the other common theme, is contributing and being of service through that. So whatever it is that you're here for, whatever it is that you are focusing on expanding your potential for, ensure that it aligns, which normally it does, with being able to give back in some way. And I think that's really beautiful. A lot of these high achievers that I've interviewed, yes, they've achieved many things, but they've also influenced other lives. As you suggest with Nita Sweeney, someone influenced her to get off the couch and run 5 kilometers. And now she's doing ultra marathons, may I
In
add.
her, how old is she? Is it her
She's in her
60s?
yeah, I think 50s or
50s,
60s,
60s?
late
Okay.
50s or 60s.
Unbelievable.
But it's, being able to almost be an influence just by the person that you show up as. And of course, you can take action in helping people, but understand just, going back to that element of self-responsibility, just by showing up and being you and taking responsibility for who you are is service in and of itself,
Beautiful.
which I think is really beautiful. I think in relation to, whether I get nervous, no, not really, which is really lovely.
Yeah, no, I'm not surprised by that at all. Yeah.
Exposure therapy.
Well, you can you move through it anyway, and the more I think points of reference that you have for knowing you're gonna be okay, it's gonna like you act in spite of, and I think that is actually a really wonderful message. As I have been a performer for many years of my life and have been on stage playing music, and I still feel the nerves before getting on stage. It's been a while because I haven't played since COVID, but what's different about it is you recognize that feeling, and you interpret it a little bit differently. So instead of interpreting it in a fear inducing way, or interpreting it as in a negative way, you see it as, oh, you know what? This means that I care.
Yeah,
This means that I
beautiful.
actually care about what I'm doing. I'm not just like going through the motions. I'm not just being a zombie. I'm doing
Yeah.
something that makes me feel alive. I'm doing something
Yes,
that I really care
exactly.
about and love. And so that's why I feel nervous. That's why I
Yeah.
feel, and it's not bad. Like you said, I mean, it's like, we're not judging it. Hopefully the nerves are there. And I try to see it as a reminder of like, that means you're on the right path. That means you're
Yes.
doing, you're doing the thing that means something to you. So
Yeah. And I think also like what has helped me in line with just doing the thing is getting really clear on why I'm doing the thing. So
mm,
it's like I used to probably get nervous because I was intimidated by the
mhm,
guest. Um, I didn't want to sort of like stuff up with what I was saying. These expectations that we have and these comparisons that we have. And now it's like I will center myself before I start a podcast if I feel, nervous at any point and be like, what is really important to me? Why am I doing this? And it's just, I'm here to just connect with another human being and have a really beautiful conversation and hope that we can both show up in our authenticity and be who we are and hopefully inspire other people. And it just kind of recenters me and calms
beautiful.
me.
Any other personal takeaways from your journey thus far in podcasting? How
Hmm.
it's maybe either what you've learned about yourself or rewards that have come out of it.
Um, Certainly a reward would be just networking with amazing people. Just the access that I've been able to have purely because I have a podcast to certain people is just absolutely incredible. I'm very grateful for that. And being able to, as a lover, an avid reader, being able to read books and then ask personal questions to the author about
Yeah,
their experience is really, really fun. I've just loved that so much. Um, and I think in terms of just like learning personally, um, I think sort of as I shared when I have reflections about like being grateful for making that decision just over a year ago to do
mm,
this is just understanding the power of like hindsight in positivity as well. That like if I hadn't, I would have missed out on all these amazing things. I certainly wouldn't be sitting here talking to you. And it's like really like there's no element of too late, but if it's on your mind and it's like intuitively feels right, and particularly if it's been on your mind for a while, like really, I really encourage you, like lean into it, have the courage, start small if you need to, but just start because
and be proud of
if we
yourself for each step that you take. Yeah.
exactly and yeah, it doesn't have to be this big jump from I'm afraid of self-expression to starting a podcast and working through it publicly, but um I really feel like, and I mean this plays into my coaching as well from that lesson, is like if it hangs around and it's sort of just like keeps tapping you on the shoulder like, hey, look at me, this is something that I think is right for you, don't ignore it. Like don't do that to yourself, I think, because long term you'll experience more pain living a path that's not true to you than the fear in the moment of changing that next step, changing the direction of that next step. I think um it's so important to make the hard decisions. That's something I've learned, going back to all the stories that I've shared in this conversation, of so much of it that has led me right here right now, the lessons I've learned, the experiences I've had, is because I made the hard decisions. And it got messy. Like, this isn't by all means me saying that today you make the decision to live your truth and it's all just going to fall into line. That's not always the case, but
I can
it
vouch for that.
shouldn't. Yeah. Yeah, but yes. But it's worthwhile.
Mm.
It's so worthwhile to be messy and authentic than to have everything in line and full of certainty and to not be living your truth.
Beautifully said. One final question for you, Jennah-Louise, and thank you again so much for this conversation. I have
Thank
totally
you.
enjoyed it and
Me
really
too.
appreciated it. So where, at this moment in time, who is the person you want to be now and moving forward at this stage of your journey?
I love that question. I think because I kind of like almost fall in line with the question of what does it mean to you to be human, like my own question, because I've been reflecting on that recently. And I think for me, it's like I had these sort of three elements. One is continue this element of self-exploration, of really enjoying the journey of coming home to who I am, aligning the personality with the soul, so to speak. And enjoy that as a never-ending journey while I'm here in this lifetime. To not put pressure on it, but to have fun with it and be playful with it. And I think the second element is, self-expression. So in aligning more with who I truly am in my unique essence, to be able to be confident enough to share that with the world. And thirdly, sort of this idea of self-expansion, and through that to, expand my potential, and by virtue of that, create something in this lifetime and contribute to whatever that feels right for me at the time. That's certainly what I'm focusing on at the moment, and it's kind of the theme that I play into. But I think it's to the person I want to be is just to continually be authentic, and that requires courage. So to probably continue to be courageous. And I was reflecting on my purpose in life recently, and this element of connection continues to come back. And I wrote, I want to guide people to connect, like deepen the connection with themselves, others in life, so they can experience true freedom. So I guess this kind of goes back to this element of freedom, is like that sense of inner peace comes from living a life that is not in fear. And I think that's what I'm really passionate about, is that for myself, but in this element of connecting others, is whenever we're in this fearful state, we're disconnected. And so it's in enabling and guiding people to be able to reconnect and to live in that place of sort of inner peace and joy and love, versus this sort of element of separation and psychological suffering.
Wow. Beautifully said. Thank you again. And I just want to piggyback onto something that you said there with another question, which was, I heard in another conversation that you had something that you tell yourself that is a shift that allows you to shift when you're in a very anxious place. I don't know if you remember what I'm referring to, but you basically said that when anxiety presents itself now, instead of escalating it, what is it that you say, or what is it? How do you switch the energy? How do you?
Yeah. Yeah, this has been really helpful for me, as someone that experienced substantial anxiety, is understanding that I am not fearful of the future. I'm fearful of my projection of the future, that our future at this point in time is empty. I did not know what conversation we would have. I do not know what will happen tomorrow or in a week. So anything that we fear in the future, we have to understand is just our imagination. And so that's beautiful, because it brings the power back to us. So instead of being fearful of the what ifs that could happen, that are all sort of come with this sort of negative, fearful energy, I always reframe it and just think pure possibility, just pure possibility. Anything can happen. And it opens me up to more of thinking of like, okay, well, what would I like to happen? What would be great if that happened? And really sort of live from this energy that like pure possibility, anything can happen, and take action from that energy towards what I desire, versus reacting to what I don't want to happen, because that's a terrible way to live, is like living this life in avoidance of what you don't want to happen, which is purely just a projection and not actually something that may happen. It's an awful way to live, and I've been there, and it's a state of suffering. So to kind of go into this element is really an anchor for me. At any point that I start feeling anxious, I just go pure possibility. And there's an element of faith that comes with that. As I sort of shared earlier in the podcast, you know, I am a big believer of co-creation. And what I mean by that is this balance between faith and action. So I take action on what I can control, but in what I can't control, I have faith that it will serve me, that it will help me to grow, and it'll help me to learn and give back, and I can be of service. Because a lot of those crucible moments in our life that I know is so hard in the moment are the ones that are our greatest teachers, and that a lot of the time we can be of service to other people moving forward that are in their own sense of suffering in that. So I think it's to always understand that you can learn, grow, and be of service through anything that comes to you that is difficult, and to take action on that, and to be open to receiving. Like, I'm not afraid. Most of the time I'm not afraid anymore, because I'm like, okay, I trust what's going to happen. And I trust that I am responsible, and I have the power within myself to be able to move through whatever is happening, and be able to be of service because of that.
Am I glad I asked? Yeah, I think the hardest part of what you described is having the presence of mind when you're in the anxious state. Having the presence of mind. And I imagine, you know, of course, like as with most things, it comes with practice of being able, you know, just having the awareness of, oh, you know what, I'm anxious, therefore I should, what do I need to tell myself? You know, stop, you know, imagining gloom and doom, which isn't already, you know, it hasn't come to fruition yet. Why not instead, you know, switch your focus and keep these things in mind. Like I'll be able to handle whatever comes my way. I'll be able to, even if I hate it, like I'll be able to use it in some productive way on behalf of myself and other people. But again, it's being able, it's easy to say now in this conversation. Yeah, it's a practice. It's a practice. Beautifully said. And I'm going to work on that myself. And in fact, actually, I did have a moment of anxiety. I don't even remember what the context was. And I thought of your mantra, that pure potential, you know, and it got me to dismantle, like, hey, calm down. So
anything like, pure possibility, trust, like that co-creation,
possibility,
faith and balance, faith with action. Okay, how can I take action in this moment that I feel anxious? And how can I have faith in whatever is to come? And I think, like, you know, it's a good in-moment tool, but for the longer term is to really get to the core of like, well, what are you actually anxious of? I feel like anxiety is such a common experience these days that we kind of just identify like, I have anxiety, but we don't actually ask deeper questions. Well, what is causing that anxiety? There's only a very small percentage of us that actually has like an actual chemical genetic imbalance. Of course, we may be chemically imbalanced because of our headspace. That's more likely than not. But be able
or our
to,
habits, you know, of not eating well, not exercising, not getting enough sleep, all those things. Yeah.
A lot of elements that are in our control, and it's our responsibility to begin reflecting and get to the core of those experiences, rather than thinking, you know, going back to this theme of thinking that I have anxiety and this is my life sentence and this is just who I am. I don't allow that in my coaching. You know, if you can go check out whether you've got the chemical imbalance or, you know, whatever it is, if you do actually need some form of medication, but 99.9% of the time you don't. And it's time to get real, and it's time to get raw, and it's time to do the hard work, because you are an extraordinary human being that is capable of so much more than living in this state of anxiety and suffering.
Jennah-Louise Salkeld, thank you again for doing this podcast with me. And I encourage everyone listening to check out her podcast, which is called To Be Human, and can be found on YouTube, Apple, and Spotify. Do I have that right?
Perfect.
Awesome.
Thank
Thanks so
you so
much,
much,
Jenna
Eric.
Louise.
It's been beautiful. Thank you so much.
Awesome.